Zekthar stood in the great hall of the Galactic Confederation, his forearms folded behind his back. The room was massive, with walls that stretched up so high they seemed to touch the stars themselves. Representatives from 100 different worlds sat in their seats, watching him with various types of eyes. Some had 2 eyes like humans. Others had 6 or 8. A few had none at all and sensed the world in ways Zekthar could never understand. "Observer Zekthar," the High Commander spoke. Her voice echoed through the hall. She was a Krell, one of the oldest species in the Confederation. "You have been selected for an important mission." Zekthar bowed his head. He had been an observer for 30 cycles. He had watched many species and written many reports. The Confederation trusted his judgment. "The humans," the High Commander continued, "have been expanding their territory. They now control 12 systems. They have been part of our Confederation for only 80 of their years, yet they grow faster than any species we have seen in centuries." Zekthar nodded. He knew about the humans. Everyone did. They were the loud ones at council meetings. They asked too many questions. They rarely followed proper protocol. Most species found them annoying. "There is a conflict brewing at the border," the High Commander said. "The Kresh Empire has begun attacking human colonies. The humans have refused our offer of military support. They insist on defending themselves." A ripple of amusement passed through the hall. The Kresh were warriors, bred for battle. Their empire had stood for thousands of years. Humans were barely children by galactic standards. "You will go to the human fleet," the High Commander ordered. "You will observe their military operations. You will report on their capabilities and their temperament. The Council needs to know if these humans require our protection, whether they want it or not." Zekthar felt confident. This would be easy work. He had seen the humans at conferences. They were emotional and impulsive. They would likely suffer heavy losses against the Kresh, and then the Confederation would step in. His report would be simple and straightforward. "I will not fail the Council," Zekthar said. 3 days later, Zekthar arrived at the human fleet assembly point. A transport shuttle carried him to a ship called the UNS Defiance. He looked at the vessel through the shuttle window and felt his confidence grow even stronger. The ship was scarred with marks from old battles. Its hull showed patches where repairs had been made. This was not a proud warship of the Confederation. This looked like something that should be in a scrapyard. The shuttle docked, and Zekthar stepped aboard. The first thing he noticed was the noise. Music played from somewhere down the corridor. He could hear humans laughing. Someone shouted something about food. This was a military vessel, yet it sounded like a marketplace. A human woman approached him. She wore a uniform with stripes on her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her eyes were a dark brown color. She smiled at him, showing her teeth. Zekthar knew this was a human greeting, not a threat display. "Observer Zekthar," she said, extending her hand. "I'm First Officer Lisa Grant. Welcome aboard the Defiance." Zekthar touched her hand briefly with one of his own hands. The gesture felt strange. Most species bowed or simply acknowledged each other with words. "Captain Morrison is waiting to meet you," Lisa said. "Follow me." They walked through the corridors of the ship. Humans rushed past them in every direction. Some carried equipment. Others were eating food while they walked. One human was actually sleeping while standing up, leaning against a wall. None of them seemed to follow any organized pattern. "Your crew seems very relaxed," Zekthar observed carefully. Lisa laughed. "Yeah, the captain runs a pretty loose ship when we're not in combat. He figures people fight better when they're comfortable." This made no sense to Zekthar. Military discipline was important. Soldiers needed structure and order. How could they function in chaos? They reached the bridge. Zekthar stepped inside and saw more controlled chaos. Humans sat at various stations, monitoring screens and talking to each other. One human was throwing a small ball to another human across the room. They caught it and threw it back while still watching their screens. A man stood in the center of the bridge. He was tall for a human, with short gray hair and lines around his eyes. He wore a uniform that looked worn and comfortable rather than crisp and new. He turned when Zekthar entered and smiled. "Observer Zekthar," the man said. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison. I hope Lisa didn't let the crew scare you off already." "I am not easily frightened," Zekthar replied. "Good," Jake said, "because we just got orders. Kresh ships have been spotted near the Hadley colony. We're heading out in 10 minutes. You wanted to observe us in battle, right? Well, you're going to get your chance sooner than expected." The bridge suddenly became more focused. Humans moved to their stations with purpose. The ball disappeared. The music stopped. In seconds, the chaotic marketplace transformed into something that looked more like a military operation. "All hands, this is the captain," Jake said, and his voice carried through the entire ship. "We have hostiles in Sector 7, battle stations. This is not a drill." Zekthar felt his confidence waver for just a moment. He pushed the feeling away. These were humans. Young, impulsive, undisciplined humans. He was here to observe their failure and report it to the Council. That was all. But as the ship began to move and the stars outside shifted, Zekthar wondered why his instincts were suddenly telling him he had made a terrible mistake. The UNS Defiance moved through space at speeds that made Zekthar uncomfortable. He sat in a chair that had been brought to the bridge for him. All around him, humans worked at their stations with a focus he had not expected. The casual attitude from before had completely vanished. "3 Kresh cruisers detected," a young human at the sensor station called out. His name tag read, "Chris Palmer." "They're big ones, Captain. Heavy class." Zekthar felt relief wash over him. 3 Kresh heavy cruisers against 1 human ship. Even a foolish captain would know to retreat. They would call for backup. This would be over quickly. "Distance?" Jake asked. 40,000 kilometers and closing, Chris replied. "Good," Jake said. He leaned forward in his chair. "Let's go say hello. Full speed ahead. Ben, I need everything you can give me." Zekthar's relief turned to horror. They were accelerating toward the enemy ships. This violated every rule of engagement he knew. When outnumbered, you retreated. You regrouped. You called for support. You did not charge directly at superior forces. "Captain Morrison," Zekthar said, standing up from his chair. "Perhaps we should wait for additional ships. 3 against 1 is not favorable odds." Jake looked at him. The human's face showed no fear. Instead, he smiled. "Observer, the Kresh are heading toward a colony with 5,000 civilians. If we wait for backup, those people die. We don't have time for favorable odds." The Kresh ships appeared on the main screen. They were massive vessels, each one twice the size of the Defiance. Their hulls were dark and covered in weapon ports. Zekthar had seen Kresh ships destroy entire fleets. His people had lost a war against the Kresh 200 cycles ago. "They're targeting us," Chris said. "Weapons hot." "Evasive pattern Delta," Jake ordered. "Lisa, get me a firing solution on the lead ship. Ben, how's my power?" "Rerouting from life support to shields," a voice came through the communication system. It was Ben Harris, the chief engineer. "You'll have 60 seconds of full power, then I need to cycle or we'll blow the generators." 60 seconds is plenty, Jake said. The Kresh opened fire. Zekthar watched as energy beams lanced through space toward them. The Defiance twisted and turned, moving in ways that seemed impossible for a ship its size. Most of the shots missed. 2 hit their shields, making the entire ship shake. "Return fire," Jake ordered. The Defiance fired back. Its weapons were smaller than the Kresh guns, but they fired faster. Zekthar watched as the human ship wove between the enemy vessels, firing constantly. It was like watching a small predator attack much larger prey, too fast to catch, too aggressive to ignore. "Their shields are adapting," Chris called out. "Our weapons are losing effectiveness." Then we change the game, Jake said. Ben, kill all power except engines and forward shields. Everything goes to the front. Captain, that's insane, Lisa said. If they hit us from any other angle, we're dead. Then don't let them hit us from any other angle, Jake replied. Do it. The lights on the bridge dimmed. Zekthar felt the temperature drop as life support reduced power. On the screen, he saw their shields collapse everywhere except the front of the ship. Full speed at the center cruiser, Jake ordered. Ram them if you have to. Zekthar gripped his chair. They were going to die. This human was mad. The Confederation would never approve such reckless tactics. The Defiance accelerated directly at the largest Kresh ship, and Zekthar prepared himself for death. 3,000 meters, Chris counted down. 2,000. 1,000. Fire everything, Jake said quietly. Now. At point-blank range, every weapon on the Defiance fired at once. The forward shields held just long enough. Energy beams and missiles slammed into the Kresh cruiser's hull. Explosions bloomed across its surface. The Defiance shot past it, so close that Zekthar could see individual windows on the enemy ship. Hard turn, Jake ordered. Get us around for another pass. But they did not need another pass. The Kresh cruiser was breaking apart. Secondary explosions tore through its interior. Within seconds, the massive warship was debris. The two remaining Kresh ships stopped advancing. Zekthar could imagine their commanders trying to understand what had just happened. A smaller ship had just destroyed one of their heavy cruisers using tactics that made no logical sense. They're retreating, Chris said, and Zekthar could hear the surprise in his voice. Let them go, Jake said. We're in no shape for another fight. Ben, damage report. We took hits to decks 3 and 7, Ben's voice came back. Hull breaches sealed. Shields are down to 20%. Weapons are hot but functional. Engines are good. We'll live, Captain. Jake stood up and stretched. The tension left his body as quickly as it had appeared. Good work, everyone. Lisa, you have the bridge. I need to check on casualties. He walked past Zekthar toward the exit. Then he stopped and looked back at the observer. Well, Jake said, was that educational enough for your report? Zekthar could not speak. He had just watched one human ship defeat 3 Kresh cruisers through tactics that defied all military logic. They had overloaded their systems beyond safety limits. They had removed their own defenses to attack. They had charged directly at ships that should have destroyed them. And they had won. How? Zekthar finally managed to ask. Jake smiled again. The Kresh expect everyone to fight like them. Big ships, heavy shields, slow and powerful. We don't have their resources, so we can't fight their way. We fight like humans. Fast, mean, and just crazy enough that they don't know what we'll do next. He left the bridge. Zekthar sat back down in his chair. His hands were shaking, all 4 of them. Around him, the human crew was already returning to their casual behavior. Someone turned the music back on. 2 humans were laughing about something. They had just fought a battle that should have killed them all. They had won through tactics that violated every rule Zekthar had ever learned. And now they acted like nothing unusual had happened. For the first time in his 30 cycles as an observer, Zekthar felt truly afraid. Not of the Kresh, not of the battle, but of the humans themselves, because he was beginning to understand something terrible. These humans did not fight to survive. They fought like creatures who had already accepted death and simply refused to acknowledge it, and that made them far more dangerous than any enemy he had ever studied. 2 days after the battle, the Defiance received a distress signal. A mining colony called Outpost Gamma 7 was under attack. Zekthar listened to the message on the bridge. The voice was human, female, and remarkably calm considering the situation. This is Sergeant Nicole Davis at Gamma 7. We have approximately 2,000 Kresh ground forces surrounding our position. We have 30 Marines and 200 civilians. Requesting immediate evacuation or support. How long can you hold? Jake asked into the communication system. There was a pause. Then Nicole's voice came back. We've been holding for 5 days already, Captain. We can hold longer if we need to. Zekthar did the mathematics in his head. 30 soldiers against 2,000 Kresh warriors. The colony should have fallen in hours, yet these humans had held for 5 days. It seemed impossible. We're 3 hours out, Jake said. Hold the line, Sergeant. We're coming. When the Defiance arrived, Zekthar looked at the colony through the viewing screens. It was a small settlement, maybe 50 buildings in total. Smoke rose from several locations. Parts of the outer wall had collapsed. Kresh forces surrounded the entire area. He could see their troops moving through the streets, fighting building to building. I'm going down with the relief force, Jake announced. Lisa, you have the ship. Kevin, get your team ready. A young lieutenant named Kevin Brooks nodded. He was already wearing combat armor. Zekthar noticed that human combat armor was lighter than what most species used. It would not stop heavy weapons fire. The humans seemed to prefer speed over protection. I will accompany you, Zekthar said. He needed to see this with his own eyes. His report required first-hand observation. Jake looked at him for a long moment. It's going to be rough down there. You sure? I am an observer, Zekthar replied. I must observe. The transport shuttle landed in what remained of the colony's central square. The moment the doors opened, Zekthar heard the sounds of battle. Weapons fire echoed from every direction. Explosions shook the ground. The air smelled of smoke and something else, something burnt and terrible. Jake and Kevin led their team toward the largest building still standing. It appeared to be the colony's administration center. Kresh warriors fired at them from windows and rooftops. The human soldiers fired back, moving from cover to cover with practiced efficiency. They reached the building and entered through a broken door. Inside, Zekthar saw the situation clearly for the first time. Wounded humans lay on the floor. A woman with a medical bag moved between them, treating injuries. Her uniform identified her as Dr. Amy Chen, the ship's medical officer. She had come down with the first wave of relief. Captain, a voice called from across the room. A woman approached them. She wore combat armor that was covered in dirt and blood. One of her arms hung at an odd angle, clearly broken. This was Sergeant Nicole Davis. Report? Jake said. We've lost 8 Marines, Nicole said. Her voice was steady despite her obvious pain. 22 still fighting. The Kresh have pushed into the eastern sector, but we've held everything else. Civilians are in the basement. No civilian casualties so far. Zekthar stared at her broken arm. You are injured. You should be with the medical officer. Nicole glanced at her arm as if she had forgotten about it. I can still shoot with my other hand. Amy has more important patients. Sergeant, you have been awake for how long? Jake asked. About 70 hours, sir. Give or take. Get some rest. Kevin's team is here now. With respect, Captain, I know this colony. My people know where every Kresh soldier is hiding. We're not leaving our post. She said it calmly, but there was steel in her voice. Jake nodded, understanding something that Zekthar did not. Then let's finish this. The battle continued through the day and into the night. Zekthar stayed near the command post, watching and recording. He saw things that would haunt him forever. He saw a young human named Danny Rogers, barely old enough to be considered an adult. The private squad was pinned down by a Kresh heavy weapons team. Without orders, Danny charged across open ground toward the enemy position. He was hit once in the leg, then again in the shoulder. He kept running. He reached the Kresh position and threw 3 grenades before collapsing. The explosions silenced the heavy weapons. His squad escaped. When they brought Danny back, he was still conscious. Amy worked frantically to stop his bleeding. Why did you do that? She asked him while she worked. They were gonna flank my team, Danny said simply, as if that explained everything. Zekthar watched Dr. Amy Chen perform surgery in a room with no proper equipment, while the building shook from explosions outside. She never stopped working, never left her patients, even when a wall partially collapsed nearby. He watched Sergeant Nicole Davis coordinate the defense while barely able to stand. She refused pain medication because she said it would make her thinking fuzzy. She directed her Marines with precise orders, anticipating enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. Late that night, Zekthar found himself sitting against a wall next to a Marine who was resting between patrols. The human's name tag read Collins. "Why do you not surrender?" Zekthar asked. "You could negotiate terms. Save lives." Collins looked at him with tired eyes. "Because the moment we surrender, those civilians in the basement become hostages or worse. The Kresh don't take prisoners they plan to treat well. So we hold. Simple as that. But you will likely die." "Maybe," Collins said. He pulled out a small photo from his pocket. It showed a woman and 2 small children. "But they won't die today. That's what matters." Reinforcements arrived at dawn. The Kresh, realizing they were now outnumbered, retreated. The colony had held. Of the original 30 Marines, 22 were still alive. All of them were wounded. None of them had surrendered. Back on the Defiance, Zekthar sat in his quarters trying to write his report. His hands shook as he worked. He had observed 300 hours of combat footage over the years. He had seen dozens of species fight, but he had never seen anything like this. The humans should have lost. They were outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted, and wounded. By every logical calculation, they should have surrendered on the first day. Instead, they had fought for 5 days and won. Zekthar began to type, then stopped. He deleted what he had written. How could he explain this to the council? How could he make them understand what he had witnessed? These humans did not follow normal patterns. They did not respond to normal incentives. They fought like cornered predators. No, worse than that. They fought like protectors who had decided that retreat was not an option, regardless of the cost. And that terrified him more than any weapon ever could. Zekthar could not sleep. This was unusual for him. His species needed very little rest, but when they did sleep, it came easily. Not anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the humans at the colony. He saw Danny Rogers running towards certain death. He saw Sergeant Nicole Davis standing on a broken arm, refusing to rest. He saw Dr. Amy Chen working on patients while explosions shook the walls around her. He needed answers. He needed to understand what drove these creatures to act in ways that defied all logic. The next morning, he found Dr. Amy Chen in the medical bay. She was checking on the wounded soldiers who had been brought up from the colony. She looked tired, but she smiled when she saw him. "Observer Zekthar," she said. "What can I do for you?" "I have questions," he replied, "about human biology, about your combat behavior." Amy gestured to her office, a small room attached to the medical bay. They sat down, and she poured herself something called coffee. She offered him some, but Zekthar declined. The smell alone was overwhelming. "What do you want to know?" Amy asked. "During the battle, I saw humans continue fighting after sustaining injuries that should have incapacitated them. I saw soldiers stay conscious and active for periods that exceed normal endurance. How is this possible?" Amy took a sip of her coffee. "Have you heard of adrenaline?" Zekthar searched his memory. "A chemical produced by most species during stress." "Right, but in humans, it does something special. When we're in danger, our bodies flood with adrenaline. It blocks pain. It increases strength. It sharpens focus. Most species have a similar response, but they usually experience what we call fight or flight. They either fight or they run away." "That is normal survival instinct," Zekthar said. "Yes, But humans evolved differently. We can override the flight response. We can choose to keep fighting even when every instinct tells us to run, even when our bodies are telling us we should stop. Some people call it determination. My grandmother called it pure stubbornness. Zekthar thought about this. So, you are biologically capable of ignoring your own survival instincts? Pretty much, Amy said. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. It's not always a good thing. Sometimes it gets us killed. But sometimes, like at that colony, it's the only thing that keeps us alive. Later that day, Zekthar observed Captain Jake Morrison as he visited the wounded crew members in the medical bay. Jake stopped at each bed. He spoke to each person. He knew their names without checking any charts. He asked about their families, their homes, their plans for when they recovered. One young soldier, barely conscious from pain medication, grabbed Jake's hand. "Did we save them, Captain? The civilians?" "Every single one," Jake said. "You saved all of them." The soldier smiled and closed his eyes, falling back asleep. Zekthar followed Jake out of the medical bay. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Visit each wounded soldier personally?" Jake looked at him with surprise. "Because they fought for me. The least I can do is remember their names." "But you are their commander." "You cannot afford to become emotionally attached to every crew member." "That's where you're wrong," Jake said. "I can't afford not to be. Each person on this ship trusted me enough to follow me into battle. Some of them died because of orders I gave. The least I can do is care about who they were." That evening, Zekthar found First Officer Lisa Grant in the observation lounge. She was looking out at the stars, holding a glass of something amber-colored. "May I join you?" Zekthar asked. "Sure," Lisa said. "Want a drink? It's whiskey. Probably too strong for your species, but I can get you something else." "No, thank you. I want to ask you something." "Ask away." "I have been studying human military history. I read about battles where humans fought against impossible odds. There is a place called the Alamo, another called Thermopylae, a forest called Bastonia. In all these battles, humans were vastly outnumbered, yet they fought anyway. Many died. Why do your people remember these defeats as victories?" Lisa was quiet for a moment. She took a sip of her drink. "They're not defeats, not really. Those people could have run. They could have surrendered, but they stood their ground because someone had to. Someone had to slow down the enemy, to buy time, to show that we don't break easily. But they died. Yes, but their deaths meant something. That's what we remember. Not that they lost, but that they refused to quit. It's in our culture now, in our DNA. When things look impossible, we remember those people and we think, if they could hold the line, so can we." Zekthar felt something cold settle in his chest. "You celebrate death." "No," Lisa said firmly. "We celebrate courage. We celebrate sacrifice. We celebrate people who stood up when they could have sat down. Big difference." The next day, Zekthar met with Chief Engineer Ben Harris in the engine room. Ben was working on repairing the damage from their last battle. His hands were covered in grease, and he was cursing at a stubborn piece of equipment. "Observer," Ben said when he noticed Zekthar. "Come to watch me fix this mess?" "I came to ask about your tactics during battle. You overload systems beyond their safety limits. You reroute power in ways that risk catastrophic failure. This seems reckless." Ben laughed. "Oh, it is reckless. Completely insane by any engineering standard. But you know what? Sometimes reckless wins, fights that careful loses. The enemy expects us to follow the rules. When we break them, we surprise them. And in battle, surprise can mean the difference between living and dying. But you could destroy your own ship." "Could," Ben agreed. "But I haven't yet. You want to know the secret? We're all a little bit crazy. Every single human. We know the risks, we know the odds, and we do it anyway because not doing it means people die. So yeah, I push these engines past their limits. I make repairs that shouldn't work. I break every safety protocol in the book. And I do it with a smile because that's what keeps this crew alive. That night, Zekthar had his first nightmare. He dreamed of humans standing in fire, their bodies burning, but their eyes still focused forward. They did not scream. They did not run. They just stood there, holding weapons, refusing to fall. He woke up in his quarters, all four arms shaking. He looked at his hands and realized something terrible. He finally understood the humans, and that understanding was the most frightening thing he had ever experienced. They were not brave. They were not noble. They were something far more dangerous than that. They were creatures who had looked at death and decided it was just another obstacle to work around. They were beings who could choose to fight when fighting made no sense, simply because someone had to. The Confederation thought humans needed protection, but Zekthar now knew the truth. It was everyone else who needed protection from the humans, should they ever decide to become enemies instead of allies. The alarm woke everyone on the ship. Zekthar rushed to the bridge, his heart beating faster than normal. He had learned to recognize that alarm. It meant combat was coming. Captain Jake Morrison was already in his chair when Zekthar arrived. The entire bridge crew was at their stations. The casual atmosphere that usually filled the space had vanished completely. "Report," Jake said. 40 Kresh vessels have jumped in near the Void Gate," Chris said from his station. His voice was tight with tension. "They're moving to intercept the civilian convoy heading to the inner colonies." "How many ships do we have?" Jake asked. 5, Lisa replied. "Us, the Ranger, the Liberty, the Warrior, and the Guardian. That's it, Captain. Everyone else is 3 hours away at minimum." Zekthar did quick calculations in his head. 5 human ships against 40 Kresh vessels. The correct military response was obvious. Retreat. Evacuate the convoy. Return with proper forces. Any commander in the Confederation would make that choice. "Get me a channel to all ships," Jake said, "and someone get me a damage estimate if we try to hold that gate." "Captain," Lisa said quietly, "the math doesn't work. Even if we fight perfectly, we can't win this." "I know," Jake said, "but that convoy has 20,000 civilians, families, children. If the Kresh get through, they all die. So we're not talking about winning. We're talking about how long we can hold." Zekthar stood up. "Captain Morrison, this is suicide. The Confederation has protocols for this situation. You evacuate what you can and retreat. You preserve your forces to fight another day." Jake looked at him. The human's face was calm. "Observer, those protocols might work for species that have a dozen colonies to fall back to. Humans have 12 systems total. That's our entire civilization. We don't have spare colonies. We don't have backup populations. Every person matters. So no, we're not retreating." The communication channel opened. Zekthar could see the faces of the other human captains on the screen. They looked tired. They looked scared, but not one of them suggested retreat. "Gentlemen, ladies," Jake said, "I won't lie to you. This is bad. 40 enemy ships, 5 of ours. The Confederation would tell us to run. But that convoy behind us has our people in it, our families, our future. So I'm asking you to hold this gate until the cavalry arrives. Who's with me?" There was no hesitation. All 4 captains responded immediately. "The Ranger stands with you. Liberty is ready. Warrior confirms. Guardian is in position." "All ships," Jake said, and Zekthar heard something new in his voice. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was determination mixed with something darker. "Weapons free. Formation Delta. If they want through this gate, they go through us first. And we're going to make them pay for every meter." The Kresh fleet arrived like a wall of death. 40 massive ships, their weapons glowing with power. They moved in perfect formation, confident in their overwhelming numbers. The 5 human ships accelerated toward them. Zekthar gripped his chair as the battle began. It was nothing like the first fight he had witnessed. This was not tactics. This was not strategy. This was 5 small vessels throwing themselves at an enemy that should have crushed them in seconds. The Defiance twisted and dodged, its weapons firing constantly. The other human ships did the same, each one moving independently but somehow coordinating perfectly. They focused fire on individual Kresh ships, destroying one, then moving to the next. But there were too many enemies. The Kresh surrounded them, firing from all sides. The Liberty took a direct hit to its engines. It started to drift, unable to maneuver. "Liberty is down," Chris reported. "They're still firing, but they can't move." Zekthar watched as the crippled ship continued to fight. Its weapons never stopped firing. Even as Kresh ships closed in around it, the Liberty kept shooting, kept fighting, kept burning. "Liberty to all ships," a voice came over the channel. The captain sounded calm. "We can't run, but we can still fight. We're going to ram the nearest dreadnought. Clear the area." "Captain Shaw, negative," Jake said. "We can tow you clear." "No time, Jake, but tell my family I held the line. Liberty out." Zekthar watched in horror as the Liberty accelerated on emergency power directly into a Kresh dreadnought. The collision was massive. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that consumed everything nearby. 2 more Kresh cruisers caught in the blast were destroyed as well. 1 human ship, 4 enemy vessels gone. "Keep fighting," Jake said, his voice hard. "Make it count." The battle raged for hours. The Guardian lost its weapons but continued to use its hull as a shield, protecting the other ships. The Warrior's engines failed, and it became a stationary gun platform, firing until its weapons overheated and exploded. The Ranger lasted the longest after the Defiance, fighting until its hull was more holes than metal. The Defiance took hit after hit. Explosions rocked the ship. Zekthar could hear screams from other decks. The lights flickered, the air filled with smoke. "Shields down," Chris reported. "Hull breaches on decks 2, 4, and 6. Weapons at 30%. "Keep firing," Jake ordered. "Captain," Lisa said. "Reinforcements just jumped in. Confederation fleet. 12 ships." The Confederation vessels opened fire on the Kresh from behind. The enemy formation broke. After hours of fighting 5 impossible humans, the sudden arrival of fresh ships was too much. The Kresh fleet retreated. The battle was over. Zekthar looked at the screen. Of the 5 human ships, only the Defiance was still capable of moving. The others were floating debris or chunks of twisted metal. He checked the casualty reports. Over 3,000 human crew members dead, 70% of the fleet. But the convoy was safe. 20,000 civilians had survived. Jake stood up from his chair slowly. He looked at his crew. "Well done, everyone. Lisa, you have the bridge. I need to go write some letters." He walked past Zekthar toward the exit. As he did, he paused. "You got enough for your report, Observer?" Zekthar looked at the human captain. Jake's uniform was torn. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were still focused, still alert. "Captain Morrison," Zekthar said slowly, "I must ask. You knew you would likely die. You knew the odds. Why did you fight?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a happy smile. "Because someone had to. Because those people in that convoy needed us. Because holding that line was more important than living through it. You came here to observe us in battle. You want to know what you should tell your superiors?" "Yes. Tell them that humanity should never be underestimated. Tell them we fight like demons when we need to. Tell them we don't surrender because we choose not to. And tell them," Jake's voice became very quiet, "that they never want us as enemies. Because we know how to surrender. We just don't." He left the bridge. Zekthar stood alone for a long time, looking at the stars. Then he returned to his quarters and began writing his report. He wrote about the battles he had seen. He wrote about the tactics that defied logic. He wrote about humans who fought past the point where any reasonable being would have stopped. He wrote about ships that kept firing even as they died. He wrote about a species that measured victory not in ships saved but in lives protected. His recommendation was simple: grant humanity full military autonomy, never interfere with their operations, never question their methods, and most importantly, never ever make them an enemy. But there was one more entry he needed to make: his personal log, the one only he would see. "I was ordered to watch humans in battle," he wrote. "Now I rue ever going, not because of what they did to their enemies, that was terrible enough, but because I understand now what they would do if we became their enemies. They showed me mercy by letting me observe. They let me see their tactics, their determination, their absolute refusal to break under any circumstances. They did this because they consider us allies. I pray that my people are wise enough to keep it that way. Because if humanity ever decides we are the enemy, I do not believe anything in the galaxy could stop them." He finished the report and submitted it to the Confederation. Then he requested immediate transfer to a remote research station far from any conflict zones. The request was approved. Zekthar never spoke about the war again, but every night he dreamed of humans standing in fire, holding the line, refusing to fall, and every morning he woke up grateful that those terrifying creatures were on his side.